Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 113 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I do want to recognize that we are meeting on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. And as always, I want to express my gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands that they've stewarded since time immemorial. A couple changes today. I do want to welcome our new clerk, Monsieur Alexandre Leger. And also, I do want to welcome Mr. Caputo, that's going to be joining our committee today as well. But pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, April 10th, the committee is going to continue its study on tax revenues from businesses on First Nations territories. But before we begin, I would like to ask that all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take notes of the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Only use a black approved earpiece. The former gray earpieces must no longer be used. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. And when you're not using your earpiece, place it face down on the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. Thank you all for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting, and I know we may have some technical difficulties, but we will navigate those as we do. So with that, I would like to welcome our witnesses that are here right now. We do have Grand Chief Joel Abram from the Association of Iroquois and Allied Nations joining by video conference, and the committee very much appreciates your patience in meeting with us again today in light of the challenges from last week, so thank you very much for that. And we also have Dr. Jacqueline Ottman, President of First Nations University of Canada, also joining by video conference. And just to inform members, Mr. Chief Delbert Wapas from the Thunderchild First Nation is unable to attend today. And we do have Grand Chief Ken Kikavichik that's going to be joining, but he's unable to join now until noon. So we will have just one round of questioning starting at noon with Grand Chief Kikavichik. So with that, we'll move into opening statements, starting with Mr. or Grand Chief Joel Abram. You have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, panel, and hopefully you can hear me better this time. My submission today, hopefully you have received my speaking notes, and for those of you that need a translation, hopefully you will get those very soon as well. My submission revolves around three particular areas: excise tax, casino ATM taxes, and also carbon taxes. The Chiefs of Ontario Chiefs Committee on Economic Development, of which I chair, we have focused on excise tax sharing and its possible feasibility. Also, we have reached consensus on focusing on excise tax, and we've been undergoing those kind of work. We did undertake a legal feasibility study from Woodward and Company, and that recommended our Chiefs Committee to move forward with a fact tax sharing framework mentioned in the federal budget. However, we're also going to be looking at this with a closer legal eye, considering the case that's going to be coming before the Quebec Superior Courts in the Quebec versus the White and Montour excise tobacco case, in which the court has already found that the charges against it would be dropped, and the Quebec's government is appealing that, and so it found that there's support from UNDRIP, which is now federal law, that they have that right to economic development, and also by the Covenant Chain Treaty, which is found to be valid. Back in 2020, then Minister Mark Miller had used that treaty to meet with the Mohawks, who were blocking the railroads at Tyendinaga. So that is an active treaty. And that's also one of the 13 areas that Quebec is trying to use to, say that treaty is no longer valid. Also, it found that the excise tax violated their treaty rights under that particular treaty. So is interesting to see where this is going to go federally. If this does get to the Supreme Court, the Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians has agreed to intervene in this case in favor of the White and Montour side and supporting those rights going forward. But we are still going to look into the other parts of that, looking into the fact tax sharing framework creation. And regardless of whether Section 89 applies to that, it's up to the federal provincial governments to create new revenue sharing agreements with First Nation leaders to ensure tax profits are allotted for First Nations community needs. I'd like to point out that in Ontario, Grand River Enterprises pays well over $200 million of excise taxes, but Six Nations themselves, they don't receive much of that money themselves. On casino ATM taxes, the problematic provincial cartel system hurts First Nation gaming hosts from making that profit. And if we look at the federal jurisdiction framework of gaming in the United States, they have a larger amount of gaming businesses. And the federal government should also consider providing partnership opportunities in internet gaming. Another option for the government, and we know this through Bill C-92 and that appeal from Quebec as well, that the federal government has the ability to override provincial legislation and recognizing First Nations jurisdiction in any area it pleases. And of course, gaming could be one of those areas as well. And First Nations did have gaming before. Also, we're looking at Vander Peet test sort of being overturned. That's a very colonial test, and it depends on meeting a European as to when your rights are solidified or not, which of course we know that's all based on racism from the 1400s and doctrines of supremacy. And with regard to carbon taxes, Chiefs of Ontario and Attawapiskat First Nations filed a judicial review after the federal government's failed to negotiate carbon pricing with First Nations in Ontario. The GGPPA established Canada's carbon pricing regime, which was meant to be a revenue neutral and had disproportionate effects on First Nations. So basically, we're asking the federal government to redevelop the policy with their communities by either exempting First Nations or allowing for cost recouping. Currently, we cannot comment on carbon taxes in any capacity due to the current legal action ongoing. And there's also been some backlash from other First Nation communities, as seen by Anishinaabe Nation and United Chiefs and Councils of Minidoux and Minising, who made an intervenor memorandum of argument to the GGPA to the Supreme Court in 2018, arguing that carbon tax overlooks the exaggerated climate impacts that already affect First Nations communities and how these impacts uniquely affect First Nations due to our cultural ties to our waters and lands. This case also shed light on Article 29 of UNDRIP and its connections to carbon tax, which expressly recognizes, among other rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands, territories, and resources. For First Nations, carbon taxes are not about federalism, but rather a violation of First Nations land rights and an affront to economic reconciliation efforts the federal government has promised. I'll just leave that there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. And with that, we will move over to Dr. Jacqueline Ottman for your 5 minutes opening statement.
Okay, so Anin, everyone, I'm humbled to join you today from Treaty 6 territory, and I am originally from Fishing Lake First Nation, which is in Saskatchewan. It's a Saulteaux or Anishinaabe community. And I'm also president of First Nations University of Canada. And so today, pursuant to the Standing Order 108, Section 2, this committee has undertaken a study to examine economic reconciliation, including ways that existing tax revenues from businesses on First Nation territories might be placed under the control of those First Nations themselves. So today I stand before you to advocate that First Nations should have autonomous control over the existing revenue streams from their own territory resources. And we've already heard one example. And so one thing that we're doing, this is beyond the notes here at First Nations University of Canada, is we're launching a National Indigenous Economic Prosperity Institute, and so we're at this pivotal moment in our ongoing journey towards economic empowerment and self-determination for Indigenous communities throughout Canada. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy, and this is the connection here, which was launched 2 years ago, is a foundational and essential document and one that encourages and guides economic reconciliation in Canada. The NIES is a blueprint for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian economy, envisioning a future where Indigenous peoples have an equal voice in managing and benefiting from natural capital, and the systemic and legislative barriers to accessing capital are removed. Indigenous futures should be self-determining, and that also includes the control of this capital. And so this is where the National Indigenous Economic Prosperity Institute, which was publicly announced at the Bank of Canada just last week, has a significant role. The Institute directly responds to the calls to economic prosperity outlined in the National Indigenous Economic Strategy, specifically call to economic prosperity number 79, which reads, establish and empower an Indigenous institute to collect and govern Indigenous data about population, businesses, lands, and resources. And this would also include information related to taxation and business. This institute will monitor and measure the implementation of the calls to economic prosperity. There are 107 calls to economic prosperity under 4 categories, including people, infrastructure, and lands. The National Indigenous Economic Prosperity Institute aims to address economic disparities by fostering sustainable development and creating new pathways to prosperity. Indigenous peoples have long been stewards of this land, possessing invaluable knowledge, culture, and traditions. Despite this, many Indigenous communities face economic challenges that hinder their full potential. The Institute will serve as a catalyst for change, promoting innovative solutions and fostering economic resilience within Indigenous communities. It will provide a platform for Indigenous-led research, development, and implementation of economic strategies tailored to our own unique needs and strengths. And also by facilitating access to resources, training, and mentorship, the Institute will empower Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses, create sustainable business models, and enhance financial literacy. It will also support policy development and advocacy efforts to ensure Indigenous voices are heard and integrated into broader economic policies. Through these efforts, the Institute aims to help build a robust and vibrant economic future for Indigenous peoples, contributing to the overall prosperity and well-being of our communities. And so this institute is both meaningful and inspirational. It's a beacon of hope, a source of creativity and motivation, and a hub of innovation. It will provide training, research, and resources tailored to the unique needs and aspirations of Indigenous communities. And so this institute is made possible with the generous financial support of 2 foundations in particular, MasterCard Foundation and McConnell Foundation. And this is a demonstration of their commitment towards economic reconciliation. And this is also what we are hoping to see demonstrated within all forms of government, federal and provincial. And so we are at First Nations University of Canada are profoundly committed to the principles of self-determination and economic empowerment for Indigenous peoples. And so this institute aligns very well with our own principles and the foundation that we have.
Dr. Arctman, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap it up.
Okay, of Indigenous knowledge systems, and so this launch, the institute is on its way to being launched, and so it is something that you will hear more about in the coming few months. Gitchimigwitch.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ottman, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity for members to ask questions that we'll be able to continue on the line that you were just speaking. But jumping right into that, the first round of questioners, we have Mr. Smale for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today on this very important topic. And I do appreciate this conversation for a number of reasons, specifically what our last witness, Ms. Ottoman, just talked about economic reconciliation. Before I jump to a line of questioning for her, maybe I could quickly start with Grand Chief Joel Abram, if I could. You were talking earlier, or I guess in your remarks, about the carbon tax and the effects that your nation are dealing with, specifically the increased costs of goods and services, but yet the rebate the government seems to champion is not being seen by your peoples.
Yes, thank you for that question. So really what we want to do is to start to have that conversation with the federal government, on that cost recouping and, that disproportionate impact. And it varies from region to region too. Whether you're remote or a smaller or larger First Nation, those impacts are going to vary quite widely. So, we think that there is a way to fix this by way of starting to have those important conversations. And that's something that I think all First Nations in Ontario really want to proceed with that. Rather than going the legal route all the time, I think it's always better to have these kind of conversations and solve those things that way, rather than just being told no and being forced to go to legal route.
So as we talk about the area of taxation and jurisdiction on reserve, you touched on it a bit in your remarks. Maybe you could elaborate if you want, kind of the importance to your community if your nation were able to keep more, if not all, of the the fuel, the alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, gaming, that type of thing. That revenue would kind of change the dynamic from the current status quo, which is money leaving your land only to beg Ottawa for it back later.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that's part of economic reconciliation, is to not have those kind of handcuffs on. And I think in a larger context is doctrines of superiority are sort of woven into the fabric of legislation and federal policy. Nobody alive today was responsible for those, but those were definitely based on 1400s racism all the way back to papal bulls and whatnot. And so I think we have to start to decolonize that relationship, and economic reconciliation is a big part of that. And recognizing the old treaties that are still in effect that Canada relies on for its holdings of the land. But again, we never had those conversations about how First Nations interpretations of the treaties were different than what's written on paper. I think we saw that with the medicine chest clause a few years back. I think it was Treaty 8, where it was found that elders' cultural knowledge was used to argue for that medicine chest. And so that just goes to show that oral traditions are also invaluable when it comes to finding out about what treaties are valid, whether they're post-Confederation or pre-Confederation treaties as well. So, yeah, that's the basis is we want to have as much First Nation jurisdiction and sovereignty as we initially had. And we reject the notion that it should be a father and child relationship. And our original relationship is more born along the lines of the Truro Wampum or the Silver Covenant chain, which is that relationship, once it becomes tarnished, one party shakes the end of the chain, the other person feels it, that's holding the other end, and then to get together and sort of polish the chain, so to speak, to renew that relationship. As you know, silver becomes tarnished if you don't take care of that relationship. And so I think that's part of what we're doing here is addressing those kind of things.
So, Grand Chief, you talked earlier about the decolonializing the atmosphere that we're in right now, the space that we're in right now. How, given the fact that we have multiple pieces of legislation, we have court decisions, treaties, how do you see the piece by piece going to get to the point that you're talking about?
I think that's, part of. I know the government likes to do a pan-Aboriginal approach, which is a one-size-fits-all, and sometimes that's just not always possible, depending on which treaty area you're in. And sometimes you have areas that don't even have treaties, like British Columbia. They don't have any, except for their modern-day ones like Niska and whatnot. But they're not covered off by any. So, and I think most First Nations would reject that anyway. Like the Anishinaabe Nation is different than Haudenosaunee Confederacy and so forth. And they even have different treaties. For instance, in Ontario, we have the Beaver Hunting Grounds, which is covered off by the 1701 Nanfan Treaty, the 1701 Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which also led up to 1764 at Niagara Falls with a declaration there, the proclamation. So there's a lot of overlapping things that we have to look at, and it's just and it's not pan-Aboriginal doesn't work a lot of the times.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmale. That concludes our first questioner. Next, we have Mr. Pawlowski for 6 minutes.
Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. I think this is an interesting study, and one of the most interesting things about it, I think, is we've got a bit of a fundamental problem here. I think generally taxes are a good thing. If we didn't have taxes in our society, we wouldn't be able to pay for healthcare, we wouldn't be able to pay for education, we wouldn't have roads to drive on, we wouldn't have bridges to cross, we wouldn't have sanitation, we wouldn't have water, we wouldn't have any of these things, nor would we have the money to address things of common concern, like putting money into research into diseases which affect us, putting money into addressing climate change, which seems to affect us all. So there are very definite benefits that come to our society from taxation. And I know within the Indigenous community, there's all kinds of available taxes, like the First Nations sales tax, First Nations goods and services tax. There's real property tax under the First Nations Fiscal Management Act, Land Management Act. And apparently, and most interesting to me, 14 self-governing Aboriginal groups have actually enacted income tax. I think pretty clearly, and maybe I can first start off with Dr. Ottman, that is money that can be used for the betterment of Indigenous communities. Now the problem, and here's the fundamental problem, is we seem to be having trouble finding chiefs to come and talk to us about this because you know what? It's not real popular when you impose a tax. Nobody wants to be taxed, including me. If you ask Marcus, you say, "Hey Marcus, I'm gonna start taking 20,000 more a year off your taxes. How are you going to like that?" I'm going to say, "No, thanks, but keep the taxes as they are." I don't like that. So maybe Dr. Ottman, you can start off by talking about like what is the very real obstacle, because I think and you realize that First Nations can use its tax authority to its advantage. However, you're relying on political leadership who's going to have to potentially bear the cost of imposing those taxes. So I'm sure there's a trade-off, and maybe you can wax philosophically about this issue for me.
Thank you for those comments. And I think what we are doing is, to a large degree, positioning ourselves to take steps into new territory. Right. And of course, there has been dialogue for many years about how First Nations or Indigenous peoples benefit or don't benefit from the taxes that are imposed upon them. And the reality is that many, in my case, First Nations peoples do pay tax. Very few on the prairies actually benefit from the the one tax that's alleviated, and so and in Saskatchewan we do have numerous urban reserves, and there are, as you mentioned, First Nations that are imposing forms of tax that will directly benefit the community and individuals within the community. And in our situation, I'll talk about First Nations University of Canada, which has been around since we're in our 47th year. So many people don't realize that this institution has been in existence for this long. And two of our locations are situated on urban reserves. So we have our Regina campus and our Saskatoon campus are on urban reserves, and our Prince Albert campus is not. And we run into a situation where the employees in our Prince Albert campus are taxed. They because they're not, even though our work is for First Nation peoples, we see ourselves as a solution to many of the issues that are experienced within our communities today, and that's education. And so we and the barriers that we're experiencing are connected to CRA, right? And how Prince Albert is deemed taxable, even though our primary campus is two of them on urban reserves.
Sorry, can you just clarify that for me? So if you're on an urban reserve, then because it's a reserve, you don't pay income tax. But is it St. Albert that's not on the reserve, and so you do have to pay tax in that?
It's Prince Albert. It's northern Saskatchewan. And so we have a campus there. We have 3 campuses. And even though the building is owned by Prince Albert Grand Council, a First Nation organization, the employees within that campus do pay, all taxes. And so that is a challenge that we have right now with CRA. It was just a decision that they made, and even though our primary campus is located in an urban reserve in Regina, those First Nation employees are seen differently. So it's very frustrating. And this is something that First Nation businesses and organizations navigate every day, right? And of course, there are benefits and everybody understands the benefits of taxation, but then there's also the quality of.
Doctor, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. We've gone quite a bit over time for this question, but I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to continue that with another one of the members here shortly. Avec ça, je vais donner la parole à Monsieur Lemire pour.
With that, I will pass the floor to Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Well.
Vous avez élaboré en 2022 une stratégie de réconciliation économique visant à nommer et fournir des directives claires pour les peuples
And maybe I'll be speaking French, and we can see if they can hear the interpreter. Can the English? Thank you. So I'll start again with Mr. Lemire. You have the floor. Thank you, Chair. So, along with many other organizations from First Nations, you developed in 2022 a strategy for economic reconciliation, wanted to give clear directives for Indigenous people to reach their economic goals. A report given in 2020 on the development of relationships between Indigenous organization. This gives a roadmap for Indigenous economic development, and and last week you announced the creation of the Institute for the Prosperity of the First Nations. Could you speak to us about your priorities and the immediate needs that you identified for your organization?
Yes, I can. Thank you for that comment and question. So the National Indigenous Economic Strategy that was launched 2 years as I mentioned, under 4 categories, infrastructure, finance, people, and lands, and there's approximately 25 calls to Indigenous economic prosperity under each one of those categories. And so this strategy is not just for Indigenous communities or people to implement, it's for all Canadians. Organization, the corporate sector, it's like the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, where everyone has a role in implementing those calls to action, and so the objective here, one of the goals, is for the well, not only an economic reconciliation, but for the collaboration of Indigenous, non-Indigenous businesses and people that will contribute to economic prosperity for Indigenous peoples, which benefits all Canadians. So it is a reciprocal, mutually beneficial document. And since many Indigenous people still live in poverty, this is and experience barriers to success, this strategy is a roadmap for all Canadians. And so the launch of the National Indigenous Economic Prosperity Institute is very important, in that this institute will act as a hub. It will generate research, will compile case studies, will track the implementation of the calls to economic prosperity by every sector, will market, or will those will be compiled, will showcase the successes of whether it's the federal government or corporate sector or health sector or education sector in implementing these calls. And it's very much like the Truth and Reconciliation Center, which does something similar, which is track and promote. And so the Willie Littlechild, who is one of he was involved in the development of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, did also indicate that there was a gap in those TRC calls to action of economic reconciliation and Indigenous economic prosperity. So this is what this document does, is it fills that gap. It is a living document that's been highlighted, and so it could reshape. It could grow in a couple years after review, after feedback, and we live this document for a couple years. Then there could be this revisiting of this particular strategy. So it is it does provide an essential roadmap, and what we're doing now is we will be posting a position for an executive director, and a team is going to be hired, and they will hit the ground running. There's a marketing budget. We are very grateful again to the foundations for helping us launch this particular institute. A lot of people don't know that there's approximately 26 Indigenous entrepreneurship and business association across the country, and so what this institute will do again is support those associations, but also be a connector, a hub for those associations.
Le coût de cet appel à la prospérité autochtone.
What is the cost of this call for economic prosperity in 30 seconds? The beginning of the question was inaudible.
Okay, the cost is dependent on the commitment of an organization, right? The institute itself is going to be housed within First Nations University of Canada, and right now we have just under $7 million that will help launch the institute. But let's say for a municipality, they might choose 4 calls to Indigenous economic prosperity that they're going to focus on, and how they're going to do that may be unique to another municipality, right? And there is that probably that financial commitment initially that an organization will bear, but one of those initiatives could be, as I'm thinking about the city of Regina, their procurement policy says that 20% of their procurement will go to Indigenous businesses, right? So that is an example of economic reconciliation. It does meet some of the calls to economic prosperity that are mentioned.
Thank you, and sorry, Dr. Ottman, I'm going to have to cut you off there. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire. And last in our
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Ms. Idlaut, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I wish to thank you, first of all, for your report. And it makes it easier to understand taxation. The Grand Chief, Joe Abram, I have a question for you. When you talked about taxes in the old days, and nothing has changed, no upgrade, no revisions, some things have to be revised and brought up to date. Can you talk a little more about how much work is required to bring us up to date? There are recommendations and resolutions. I want to learn more about for Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, our lifestyles, our lives, our bylaws, our own laws, and our own philosophy has to be incorporated into current day changes today, like this one, if we revise certain things.
Yes, thank you for that question. I don't think there's any really easy answer to that, but I do think that when it comes to benefiting from taxation, I kind of think First Nations historically have been at the bottom of the list. If you take a look at housing deficits and who has actually benefited from the land and the resources that have been extracted from it, it hasn't been First Nations. When you look at the vast amounts of money that have been created through tobacco, which is one of our medicines, it really hasn't been First Nations until recent decades, really. And if you talk about wealth, it's more than just money. It's more of a holistic view. Well-being is part of that, whether it's social, emotional, mental, spiritual, financial, again, our social innovation, social finance, entrepreneurship. which is coming back now, cooperatives, nonprofits, and essentials, which are things that we really have struggled with in historically, which is housing, food, employment, purpose, and education. And a lot of this has stemmed from things like the Indian Act, which really limited what you could do. For instance, we're just now playing catch up with regards to inclusion of indigenous peoples in the economy. For a long time, we couldn't even hire lawyers, for an example. We couldn't vote, so we haven't really been included. And so we really just want to catch up. We're playing catch up. We haven't had statutory funding. We've had funding that's been discretionary funding, and which is at the goodwill of the government. And I think hopefully we can all agree that the government hasn't had a lot of goodwill when it came to First Nations. If you take a look at how many boil water advisories there have been over the past few decades at the housing crisis, all these murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, we know that there hasn't been a lot of support for First Nations, and there hasn't been a lot of benefit from the taxation when it comes to supporting that. First Nations now control less than 1% of the land mass within Canada, and so Canada's enjoyed 99% of the land and the resources that have come out of that. And so we need to look at things not just in terms of taxation, but in terms of resource revenue sharing, and also looking at taking care of the environment in a sustainable way so that the next 7 generations can enjoy it the same way that we do today. And again, enjoyment of the environment is another form of, I think, economic reconciliation. There's tourism and all sorts of things that we can do nowadays. So I think in terms of taxation, we've gotten a short end of that, receiving the benefits of taxation. And there's all sorts of hidden taxes we haven't really talked about either yet, that are all sorts of goods and services that we get. So hopefully that helps to answer your question.
Thank you. The federal government stated that they would produce economic reconciliation. I'd like to understand more about this from you, from the federal government, what the federal government is proposing. I'd like to hear from the Grand Chief and the Chief. What is your response to economic reconciliation, and what is your vision? I ask the Grand Chief first. Dr. Ottman will be after the Grand Chief. Thank you.
Keep it really brief. I think that economic reconciliation recognizes, the independence and sovereignty and jurisdiction of First Nations. We know that, right up until very, very recently, and I already talked about this before, about how the relationship with the federal government, sees the First Nations as children unable to take care of their own affairs, and they legislated accordingly. And that's where we got things like the Indian Act, we got residential school, we got the 60 Scoop, the ongoing child welfare situation today, underfunding for everything. There's a lot of instances of Indian agents stealing resources from First Nations. And so I think we have to kind of, in order to reconcile, we need to hear the truth about what that relationship and how lopsided it was, and really start to, like I said, decolonize that and go back to the original relationship, which was more as of equals, sharing in the resources of the land, and also the responsibilities of that as well. So I think that's really what we want to do in terms of that reconciliation. It's more of a holistic thing and involves other things besides just economics.
Thank you so much, Grand Chief. I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout, and that concludes our first round of questioning. Moving into the second round, the 5-minute round with Mr. Melillo. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both to both the witnesses for being here, part of this important discussion. I want to start with Grand Chief Abram, picking up on what my colleague asked you as well. In your opening comments, you did speak a bit about the carbon tax specifically, and it wasn't necessarily surprising for me. We've seen more and more First Nations coming out against this policy, including the Chiefs of Ontario, of course, taking the government to court surrounding the detrimental policy of the carbon tax. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate further. I believe you said it was a violation of land rights. I just want to know if you can elaborate further on what you meant by that and how you view the carbon tax.
Well, I can see sort of the necessity of doing this, especially for industries that are very carbon heavy, but they do have disproportionate impacts on First Nations, and especially within treaty territories. I know the federal government sees themselves as having total control over 99% of the land. However, First Nations do have traditional territories that they have rights within, whether there be hunting and fishing or resource rights. And so we really think that there has to be some level of government accountability to First Nations for the protection and preservation of those rights. And again, Article 29 of UNDRIP recognizes the rights of Indigenous peoples to the conservation and protection and the productive capacity of the lands or territories and resources. So again, carbon taxes to us are not really about federalism, but rather a violation of our land rights. And this kind of goes in opposition to the economic reconciliation efforts that you're talking about now. So again, I can't go into too much detail because we do have legal action on that right now, but hopefully we can get that settled sooner rather than later.
Okay, thank you very much, Grand Chief. Dr. Ottman, I'll ask you a bit about building capacity. I believe you mentioned that earlier in another comment. That's something that I think is a very important aspect of this. We see, I'm from Northwestern Ontario, there's 42 First Nations in my district, and over different communities are, of course, trying to appeal for federal funding to help get support for projects. Just when it seems like it's going to move forward, there's delays, there's bureaucratic hurdles, the government isn't ready, the costs increase, and it seems like this process drags on and on. Critical infrastructure and other needs aren't being met as a result. So how would, in your view, how would the ability for First Nations to directly collect taxation revenue assist in their ability to build capacity and move forward on some of these projects more quickly, either taking a greater lead in those projects or even going, if necessary, on their own without federal support? I'm just curious for your comments on that.
Yes, so thank you for the comment and the question. And I'll just begin by saying that there is this unique relationship between the federal government and First Nation communities, and which is entrenched within not only the treaties but the Canadian Constitution, and so there is this commitment that the federal government has to First Nation communities. I would even say infrastructure, right? As the federal government is also engaged in infrastructure, and so I don't think that the fiduciary responsibility to First Nation people should ever be eliminated or ever go away because of all of those constitution and legislative agreements, and so for First Nation people, there's a shortfall, and this is what the Grand Chief had mentioned, is there isn't parity, there isn't economic parity, and so for Indigenous governments and businesses, there is this continuous seeking of resources, financial revenue to make up for that shortfall. An example that we have is our northern campus is in a very old building, and it's situated near a safe injection site. So the city of Prince Albert has given us 5 acres of land for $5 in a amazing location, and so we submitted a $25 million proposal to the federal Green and Inclusive Community Build Program. And so we had the land, we had a detailed schematic, community engagement, and as I say, education is the solution for many of the issues that we engage in. We didn't get the grant. We didn't get a reason for the grant being rejected. And so now what we have as Prince Albert Grant Council and FSIN, Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, is this challenge to, because this is a 30-year issue within that location, Prince Albert. And so
Doctor,
we are looking.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to cut you off.
Sure,
I
okay.
hate to be
Thank you.
to keep doing this, but I'm afraid we're over time here.
Okay.
And with that, we'll turn it over to the second questioner in the second round. Mr. Pulowski, you have 5 minutes.
I'll start and then I'll pass it on to Ms. Gainey. Chief Abrams, you talked about your displeasure with the carbon tax. Now, at the same time, you've also talked about climate change and climate change perhaps disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities, particularly places in the north, like my friend Michael McLeod's riding in the Northwest Territories, which has been pretty severely affected. We also know that most conservative economists actually think that the carbon tax is the most efficient way of addressing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, Chief Abrams, is your problem with the carbon tax per se, or the fact that you think First Nations should get more of the rebate, because we know it is meant to be revenue neutral? I know that Indigenous people do, like everyone else, get their individual rebate, but perhaps the argument is First Nations communities use more fossil fuels because of their isolation, their being up north, and they ought to get more of the rebate. So again, is your problem with the carbon tax per se, or the way that the rebate is handled, and figure that First Nations communities should get a better deal on the rebate?
I think the issue is twofold. One is around maybe collective, where does the benefits come in for First Nations? For instance, in helping to build infrastructure, maybe for the northern communities. We know that it is happening to a limited extent, but to support, more cleaner energy being available for those communities. I think we all know about all the greenhouse gases.
Monsieur le Président, il faudrait peut-être s'assurer que le témoin puisse parler plus proche du micro.
We should make sure that the witness might speak closer to the mic, maybe, because we can't be heard very well.
I'll try to speak a little bit louder. Is that better?
Okay, I think we're good. With that, we can continue.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I think the number one thing is we want to have more of those tax revenues, I think, going towards collective things like building that infrastructure to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases, so that, and I think that's good for the climate overall. And also, look at things like impacts of forest fires, which are, sort of like, we can make a good argument that those are climate-based. For every degree of temperature, we know that the storms are going to be more violent and have more intensity, in terms of all those things, whether they're talking about flooding, whether you're talking about tornadoes, forest fires, all those natural disasters, we can see increasing. Again, more data over the years will find this, but I think that's part of the issues with that is that there's more impact to First Nations than just what the carbon tax can speak for. So, this is especially true for northern ones where they have to evacuate every summer or every spring, from fires and from flooding. and all those sorts of things that happen.
Monsieur le Président, je suis obligé de vous arrêter encore. Le son coupe pour l'interprétation, donc ça rend l'interprétation difficile.
The sound is cutting from time to time, breaking up, and so it makes interpretation impossible.
We'll just pause for 1 minute here. But, Monsieur Lemire, si c'est encore un problème,
Mr. Lemire, if it's still a problem, please let us know.
so with that, we can go back to Grand Chief.
Okay, I think the other main point that I would like to make is if we're going to decolonize that relationship and talk about taxing First Nation communities, there has to be a discussion with First Nation communities and treaty areas as well about what that's going to look like in terms of having free, prior, and informed consent, which is now federal law. Thank you.
Mr. Pulaski, you still have another minute 20.
Turn it over to Ms. Gainey.
Oh, okay, I wasn't sure. I thought you were going to bring the other witness on. That's okay. I had a question for Dr. Ottman, if she's still online with us. I was curious about the capacity building of the FNU, how you're building knowledge capacity and economic development, knowledge of economic development capacity through the university, and how perhaps we could better support, or through the university offer more support to some of the resources that, or some of the regions that have fewer resources or less capacity. It seems like there's an uneven reality across the country in terms of capacity and resources, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and perhaps what FNU can do in that regard.
Yes, thank you for that question. And for First Nations University of Canada, one of the principles that we have is being responsive to communities across the country. An example of that is we are certifying a Mohawk language program in Fort Erie, and we've had programs in Northwest Territories, and our newest programs that will begin in northern Saskatchewan, Black Lake, Hatchet Lake, which is way north, is they came to us and asked us for a social work program, and we are nimble enough to start that program this coming September for that community. And we do have an Indigenous business program, and within that program, we have, of course, financial literacy that's part of the learning, and there are leadership and executive programs that are available to First Nation leaders and their teams, and so the Institute will also broaden the scope of our reach and the capacity that we could help develop within First Nation communities and organizations.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm
yes,
afraid I'm going to
okay.
have to stop you again. And with that, we're going to briefly suspend here while we get Grand Chief Ken Kivicic logged on here. So we'll just briefly suspend. Thank you. This meeting back to order. Before going to Mr. Kivicic for 5 minutes opening, I'll just say we'll have, given the changes to our schedule today, I'm just going to give each party 4 minutes for questioning after Grand Chief Kivicic's opening remarks here. But so with that, Grand Chief, I will give you the floor for 5 minutes.
Let's see. Drin Greensey, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and honorable committee members. My name is Ken Kikavicic, and I'm the Grand Chief of the Gwich'in Tribal Council of the Northwest Territories and Yukon. Gwich'in Tribal Council, or GTC for short, was established in 1992 with the signing of the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement, and we work in collaboration with the governments of Canada, the Northwest Territories, and Yukon in implementing this modern-day treaty for our over 3,500 participants who reside across this country. Our communities are located in the Mackenzie Delta region of the Northwest Territories and are known today as Aklavik, Inuvik, Telege, or Fort McPherson as it's now known, and Sigechik. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Committee on Tax Revenues on First Nations territories. This is an important issue and an opportunity that impacts the economic development and self-sufficiency of our region. Today, I would like to raise a few points for your consideration as you undertake this study. First, the distinctions between modern treaty holders, such as the Gwich'in Tribal Council, and First Nations on reserve, for example, in southern Canada. Two, the Gwich'in interest in establishing tax-free zones both within our Gwich'in settlement region and in areas that we decide to invest. And three, the role tax revenues can play in achieving economic reconciliation. For a bit more context, the Gwich'in were signatories to the last number treaty in Canada, Treaty 11, which was signed in our communities of Sigechik and Telege in July of 1921. At the time, many of us were known as Lushu Indians, and we lived a nomadic subsistence lifestyle in our traditional territory, supplementing our living by participating in the fur industry. Treaty 11 was the only treaty in Canada that did not create reserves for the Dene of the Northwest Territories. The only reserves in the Northwest Territories today are located in Treaty 8 territory in the South Slave region near Hay River and Fort Smith. Back to my first point, it is crucial to recognize the distinct circumstances and needs of the various Indigenous groups and nations across Canada. First Nations in the prairies, for example, face unique challenges compared to non-treaty First Nations in areas as BC and modern treaty holders in the north, such as the Gwich'in. Each of us has differing legal, social, and economic contexts that must be considered when discussing tax revenues and economic policy. Métis and non-status Indigenous peoples face their own challenges, as you are well aware, particularly related to recognition and access to programs and services. Second, the Gwich'in Tribal Council is interested in establishing tax-free zones within our Gwich'in settlement region and in other locations where we have participants located in cities such as Yellowknife, Whitehorse, and Edmonton. Tax-free zones, not reserves. It is an important delineation here. Would provide tax benefits to our citizens and businesses and create opportunities for us to invest in southern centers. And finally, we are also seeking the ability to impose sales and excise taxes on non-Indigenous citizens who may utilize our businesses. Our government, our potential future government, would then be able to invest back into our communities to improve the infrastructure and services that we provide. This would directly allow for some wealth redistribution to reduce our current reliance on federal funding to provide the infrastructure, programming, and services that we offer. It would be a critical step towards the achievement of economic reconciliation. Whether it is economic development or protection of our lands and essential resources, such as the porcupine caribou, upholding the rights and the interests of the Gwich'in has been and will continue to be our priority. To be a truly sovereign nation, our nations, our language, our traditions, lands, and resources need to be governed in a fulsome and responsible manner. We believe that potential tax revenues and tax exemptions that are afforded to other levels of government at the current time, whether it is in a self-governing environment or not, will help us achieve this. In order to be effective, such legislation must recognize the jurisdictional difference between Indigenous nations, the complementary role that tax-free zones for Indigenous businesses and governments can play, and the ability of Indigenous governments to implement sales and excise taxes on non-residents accessing these services as a means to enhance these programs and services into the future. While the study on tax revenues are positive, like anything, the true measure of success will be in its implementation and its applicability to northern nations such as the Gwich'in. I thank you for your time and opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. And as mentioned earlier, we're just going to do an abridged 4-minute round for each party, starting with the Conservative Party and Mr. Shields for 4 minutes.
Thank you for your presentation. Appreciate you being here to make that presentation today. MP Zimmerman said, Bob Zimmer said to say hello. So on his behalf, I pass along that message. I think one of the things you said strongly is one size does not fit all. And in it, you're talking about a modern treaty versus historical treaties. Could you just quickly define the difference between those and the economic reality of it?
Do I just answer directly, or do I go through the committee chair?
Grand Chief, you can direct questions and answers through the chair. Thank you. And Grand Chief, you may answer, please.
Okay. Well, the last number treaty was signed in 1921, which was Treaty 11, as I mentioned here. It allowed us the ability to continue to our subsistence lifestyle while also recognizing the rights that we have to this region. It granted us a whopping $5 a year for each man, woman, and child. There was also provisions for minor payments to chiefs and headmen. It was very limited in its application, the implementation even more so. And fast forward 70 years, the modern treaties, as are now known, or the comprehensive claims policy, was an effort by Indigenous nations such as the Gwich'in to sign modern treaties that provided some real dollars, some fee simple lands to areas within our traditional territory, and has allowed for a level of economic reconciliation by providing the dollars that we require to provide programming and services to our people to better implement and reshape our agreements and reshape our relationship with, namely, the governments of Canada and others.
Is the grant structure of asking for grant structure of annual grants you might get for economic development? You're talking about a very different structure as compared to a annual grant application style of economic development. You're talking about a very enlarged structure of governance and taxing policy. How soon do you think this could be implemented?
Well, it could be implemented within the next 5 years if we so desire. It's all dependent on our current negotiations. We are one of the few modern treaty holders in Canada that does not yet have self-government. When we signed our agreement back in 1992, we anticipated that self-government would follow shortly thereafter. We didn't anticipate the millennium passing and us not being self-government. For a variety of reasons, we have been negotiating for over 24 years, and taxation has been a key impediment in the past to us achieving resolution of an agreement. As many of you will know, the federal government had a policy that required Indigenous nations that were finalizing self-governments to sign away tax exemptions afforded to their status Indian citizens. And that has changed in recent years, which allows and paves the way for us to finalize an agreement sooner rather than later. However, there are many technical differences that need to be sorted out through the negotiations process because we are one of the nations that hope to be have governing and jurisdiction authority upon day one of execution of our agreement. So taxation is a key element of our fiscal package that we are looking to negotiate with Canada.
For years, the big barrier's been the
I'm
tax
afraid-
challenge.
Mr. Shields, that's 4 minutes as the last, but I'm sure there'll be other colleagues that will probably get to the same questions, I hope. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Mr. McLeod for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Grand Chief for joining us. I appreciate your comments on this very important issue. Maybe we could just continue along the same lines as you had this discussion with the MP Shields, talking about running a government and what it takes to run a government and the dependable revenue streams that are required. You know, in most of the self-governing nations, they look at a number of different ways to raise revenues to operate their government. They look at the core funding that they get from the federal government. They look at program funding, dividends from businesses, royalties, and taxation. Can you quickly discuss the importance of taxation powers for the Gwich'in Tribal Council as you move forward with your self-government negotiations?
Well, I resided for almost a decade in the city of Saskatoon, and to the Saskatoon is Chief Darcy Bear and the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. As you may be aware, the Whitecap Dakota has been able, in the span of about
Monsieur le
3
Président,
decades,
désolé de vous
Chair, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt because the interpretation cannot be done because of the quality of the sound.
His mic should be higher.
Am I talking too quickly?
Grand Chief, we're hearing from the interpreters that it might be helpful if you could just move the boom up slightly, maybe a couple centimeters. I think it's the same spot. If you could just try moving it again, please.
Is that better?
Maybe if you could just speak a little bit and we'll see what the interpreters say.
Okay. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Whitecap Dakota has been able, in the span of 3 decades.
Sorry, Grand Chief, we're just going to have to pause again. I don't believe that's made much of a difference.
nations such as Whitecap, Dakota, we see their ability in that environment to tax a large non-resident transient population accessing their programs and services. There needs to be an ability for not only tax revenues but also tax exemptions to work hand in hand for the benefit of Indigenous governments. As you look at cases such as Whitecap, Dakota, they have been able to leverage their proximity to a major center to provide services. And I believe in some of the rare cases, it is a rare case that you do have non-Indigenous residents requesting to access services such as hospitals and schools for Whitecap, Dakota. And that has been in part because of their ability to implement sales and excise taxes in their home community. And as you know, they are the most recent self-governing nation in this country, having made their agreement effective last September.
Yeah, Grand Chief, I want to interrupt you because I need to ask this next question regarding clawbacks. How important is it to GTC that as you increase your own source revenue with taxation powers, for example, that it doesn't impact other funding streams from the federal government? We saw this as a challenge when the Clinton were trying to bring forward their self-government negotiations. And the federal government of the day, the Conservatives, were insisting that they use own source revenue. Anything generated would offset what was coming from the federal government.
It's incredibly important because, as you know, unless it's tied to non-renewable resource extraction, we do not see private investment in our region. Not to mention the fact that our low population does not present effective business cases for any entity or investment or industry that does not have large government subsidy. And so it needs to be part of a broader discussion on our fiscal chapter as it relates to self-government.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Avec ça, on va aller à...
That being said, we'll go to Mr. Lemire. We will go to Mr. Lemire for 4 minutes. Hello, Grand Chief Kavicik. During our last meeting, you had good suggestions for economic reconciliations that we find in the strategy which Ms. Ottoman presented. Would creating a Indigenous organization for imports and exports seem to you to be an effective solution to facilitate trade with the U.S. and to have free trade areas recognized as well?
I do require an interpretation.
Grand Chief, just so you know, on your screen, your Zoom screen, you will see a globe that has, if you click on that globe, you can select English, and then you'll have live translation from the proceedings into English.
Okay, it's just been selected now.
Okay, avec ça, Monsieur le...
That being said, Mr. Lemire, could you repeat your question? Thank you, Chair. So, Grand Chief Kavicik, at our last meeting, you gave us good suggestions for economic reconciliation that we also see in the strategy which Ms. Ottoman presented. Would creating an Indigenous organization for imports and exports seem to you to be a relevant solution that would facilitate trade with the U.S. and also have free trade areas recognized?
We certainly believe so. The Gwich'in Nation ourselves, if we look prior to the establishment of the Canada-U.S. border, we spanned Alaska, the Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, and we number 9,000 strong in total. And the implementation of this international border has restricted trade, whereas in the past it was very common. And like other nations, such as Six Nations and the Mohawk in southern Canada, the Gwich'in also have that need for cross-border mobility. And we believe that these types of agreements, and whether it's through an organization or not, would help facilitate that trade, particularly in our region where we have such limited access to supplies, groceries, lumber, If Alaska opens up a supply route for our communities, that certainly is a lot closer than places such as Edmonton that we currently depend upon for resupply of our communities. So logistically, especially with low water levels, is incredibly important as we move forward.
Le gouvernement devrait déposer une loi.
So the government should table a law that would guarantee the inherent rights of the First Nations, which would limit
Des projets sur des terres ancestrales. Est-ce que le consentement préalable, libre et éclairé est une condition essentielle au développement des Premières Nations?
On the system.
I will repeat the last part of my question. So, for you, is free, prior, and informed consent an essential condition for the development of projects with First Nations at the economic level?
And we look at free as shared decision making with all levels of government. In our opinion, it does not compose a veto, but also it opens up the discussion with governments and industry on potential investments in Indigenous territories. But without that early and frequent communication ahead of time, that makes things very difficult. But when that is in place, it does allow for a beneficial discussion between all parties.
Est-ce que Madame Ottoman
Would Ms. Ottoman or Grand Chief Abram want to add something about the principle of free, prior, and informed consent?
Sure. You know, as we know that it has been recognized by the Supreme Court as now being federal law, now that UNDA has passed, quantify, that has to be quantified by individual First Nations. And what that means is they're going to have their own guidelines as to what would constitute free, prior, and informed consent for them. So that's something I cannot do. Each individual First Nation is going to say, here's the kind of discussions that we have to have on a particular subject. Once we have those discussions, and then maybe we can have our free, prior, and informed consent for whatever it is to go forward.
So, apologies, Monsieur le Maire, je dois vous arrêter à ce moment.
Mr. Lemire, I need to interrupt you at this point. I know it's a topic that we could be discussing for many meetings here.
Last speaker on the second round here, Ms. Idlout, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Ken. Also, I'm happy to see you again. I recognize you. Ken and Dr. Ottman, if one of you could respond, I will ask the same question, basically. Indigenous Services Canada has indicated that they intend to, quote, work with Indigenous partners to bring forward an economic reconciliation framework which will remove barriers and support Indigenous visions for economic prosperity, end of the quote. In terms of economic reconciliation framework, what does economic reconciliation look like and mean to you? Ken, you go first.
Mussy MP Idlout, great to see you as well again, and often appreciate our many discussions on issues impacting the Northern Territories. But the Gwich'in seek what every Canadian seeks and at times takes for granted. A good job, a quality home, proper schools, access to athletics and opportunities for our young people, sound infrastructure, and a level of local economic development. In this Western economy, this only occurs with major investment by existing levels of government and private industry. And as I mentioned earlier, our communities are often prevented from this private investment that limits our local economic development. In a simple form, I do see economic reconciliation being the creation of an economy that allows for entrepreneurs to set up local businesses to provide the amenities that many of our communities do not have access to at the current time. Simple things, and I mentioned taking for granted, but like Tim Hortons, for example, in some of our major centers, the ability for access to food, the access for things that people in southern Canada enjoy, those are things that many of our people look to have in the future. So having the ability for that economy whereby we are investing in local businesses, we have good jobs, people are living in good, energy efficient homes. Right now in the north, as you all know, heat and power are very expensive, incredibly expensive. And we need to change this for the benefit of our residents moving forward so that they don't ever feel the need to move elsewhere, particularly to the south for economic reasons. So economic reconciliation for us means bringing a lot of what we see in southern Canada and the Western economy brought into our communities to allow for investment by our people and others. Let's see.
Dr. Ottman.
Yes, so as was spoken of earlier, the economy or the economic engagement of Indigenous peoples has been systematically legislated out, and that there were thriving, engaging economies and trade north, south, east, west before reserves were created and past systems and just all of these barriers that enabled or did not enable Indigenous peoples to engage in the economy. And so now there is this, I'll say, this awakening to economic reconciliation, which is very, very important. And we have just a growing number of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurship, and Indigenous governments are really have never stopped trying to engage in the economy and to develop self-determined communities. And always the barrier is, there is the commitment to economic reconciliation by ISC. However, I believe it's about $1.5 million.
Doctor, I'm afraid I'm going to have to do this again, and I apologize for this, but we are very short and we are over time again. But I do want to thank you, Doctor, and Grand Chief Abram and Kika Vichik as well. Thank you so much for your testimony today on our study. And I'm sure it'll inform really important reports and recommendations for government. So I do want to thank you. But at this time, we are going to suspend the meeting to go into in-camera, to go into committee business. So thank you very much, everybody.
Must say everybody.